Okay, we'll go to item 11, please. We have Assemblymember Chow who's got the AB 744. Welcome. This is item 11.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Senators. I'm here to present AB 744 for the second time in this committee. As you know, the purpose of the bill is to promote the development of much-needed affordable housing for California's families, seniors, and special needs populations. At last week's hearing, several of you expressed concerns with the bill. In response to those concerns, I have agreed to amend the bill as follows. First of all, I'm eliminating the requirement that local governments waive their minimum parking requirements for projects that are 100% affordable to low-income families and who are either within 1/2 mile of a major transit stop, are senior-only projects or special needs projects. Instead, I would replace this requirement with parking ratios for each subgroup as follows. First, for 100% affordable housing, low-income projects within 1/2 mile of a major transit stop, a local government could not require more than 0.5 parking spaces per unit. Second, for 100% affordable low-income housing projects that are for seniors only, a local government could not require more than 0.5 parking spaces per unit. And the project would also have to be either offer paratransit service or be within 1/2 mile of a bus that runs at least 8 times a day. Next, for 100% affordable housing projects that are home to disabled and homeless individuals, a local government could not require more than 0.3 parking spaces per unit. And the project would have to either offer paratransit or be within 1/2 mile of a bus that runs at least 8 times a day. These ratios are based on feedback from numerous stakeholders and provide some flexibility for local governments to require parking while still reining in the cost of parking enough to make these projects financially feasible. These amendments address concerns about zero parking raised by the League of Cities and also members of this committee by eliminating the possibility of projects with zero parking and adding in a public transit requirement for seniors and special needs affordable projects. Again, the zero requirement is gone. The bill would continue to, this bill would continue to allow a local government to require more parking if it has completed a parking study. To address concerns raised by the League, the amendments also increase the duration of the parking study to within 7 years of a developer's request that supports the need for more parking rather than 5 years. So in other words, they could substantiate their parking increases based on the result of the parking study. As I discussed last week, the bill is necessary to, first of all, enable developers to invest in building more affordable housing and not waste public subsidies on unneeded parking spaces. Next, it also reduces construction costs and encourages buildings of urban infill, transit-oriented development, senior and special needs housing, and also finally to support the state's goal to reduce greenhouse gas. I have one witness here to testify in support of the bill.
Thank you. Mia Kong with Domus Development. I am an affordable housing developer statewide. This bill is absolutely needed. It is very challenging to build affordable housing in our urbanized areas. And in California, all of our general plans, housing elements are really gearing towards infill, affordable, denser projects near transit. The challenge is that it can take months, if not years, to reduce parking requirements for these projects. It's very hard for a developer to work on a project if they don't know for sure that they can get their parking reduced. We have projects where we've put in required parking, a Bay Area project where it's 111 units. We put in 100 parking spaces and only 35 are being used. It's 65% overparked. That's a double 2-layer parking garage. The top layer never gets used. So that is only one example of excess parking that is required, that jurisdictions require that we build, and yet it doesn't meet with our current trends. Right now in the state of California, we have over 10 million people who do not own cars. Most of our low-income populations have lower car ownership than the average per capita owners, yet we are still being required to build excessive parking requirements, which cost considerable amounts of money, can cost anywhere from $20,000 to $60,000 a space, and it goes unused. It goes, and we cannot build housing in place of those units. Oftentimes we build lower a number of housing units so that we can actually support the parking. So parking is one of those absolutely challenging things that is a little bit out of sync with the way we're moving. As we're moving towards transit first, as we're moving to increase our options so we get people out of their cars, we're doing the opposite when we require that we have so much parking in affordable housing when the population trends. In the city of Los Angeles, per capita, the car ownership is 0.54 for every citizen in Los Angeles. So we're seeing an absolute trend with better transit and with car sharing and other alternatives. When we build in walkable communities, we give people options so they do not have to own a car if they choose not to. So I hope that this committee sees the importance of prioritizing housing and affordable housing in this bill rather than requiring that we continue to build excessive parking that in many cases are not used to their fullest. Thank you.
Okay, thank other speakers in favor, please.
Sylvia Solis on behalf of the City and County of San Francisco and the Office of Mayor Ed Lee in strong support. We believe that this bill aligns with our local planning code that encourages walking, cycling, the use of transit as an alternative to private automobiles. And we also greatly support the fact that this reduced parking requirement would significantly reduce the cost of development and increase housing affordability. So we ask for your aye vote.
Okay,
Thank you.
Marina White with the California Housing Consortium. In this era of reduced resources, it's important that we look at ways that we can reduce the cost of affordable housing development while working to find new resources. So we urge your aye vote today.
Thank you.
Victoria Rome with the Natural Resources Defense Council in support, and this is just one piece, a small step we can take to help the state incentivize affordable housing and infill development to help meet our climate and clean air and social goals. Thank you.
Daniel Savino, Association of Regional Center Agencies, and continued support.
Steve Wallach on behalf of the California Bicycle Coalition, also in support.
Rebecca Long on behalf of the Metropolitan Transportation Commission in strong support.
Joshua Stark with Transform in strong support, and also to note that 40% of houses within a half mile of transit in Los Angeles don't own a vehicle. Thank you.
Tyrone Buckley, Housing California, also in strong support.
On behalf of California League Conservation Voters in support.
Sandy George representing the American Planning Association. With these amendments, we are just about there. We have a few remaining technical issues, but otherwise we're just about in support, full support.
This bill is same as like delivery the interest to the big capital real estate developer. This is not a cuckoo bill, but anyhow, I go to support it because we had too many cars in this country already. Okay. And a lot of, I live in San Francisco, I tell you, but the parking space is really, really hard in San Francisco. It costs you about $700,000 parking space in a rich luxury area. That's why they want more space to build a house. They want to make more money. But anyhow, you have to support it because there's a big capital is behind the bill. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, other speakers in favor? Speakers opposed or concerns, please come forward, please. Welcome.
Mr. Chairman, members, Dan Carrick on behalf of the League of California Cities. We appreciate, we did have a meeting with the author last Thursday, and we do appreciate some of the amendments that were taken. I do think, however, there is still a significant gap between, there are some sort of benchmarks that are proposed. I mean, I think one debate here is making sure that, as several witnesses said, we don't want more parking than is necessary, but we want to have a sufficient amount of parking. That's kind of what we're debating. And it's a little bit difficult, obviously, because, you know, with cities, you got 482 cities. San Francisco was obviously mentioned. It's got one of the most fantastic transit systems in the country. Many of our cities have different levels of resources. So just to make you aware, I mean, there are some significant differences. Under existing law, the density bonus law has a requirement of one parking space per bedroom. In a number of our offers, we're at 50% of that, 50% of existing law. We think that's a very good faith offer. Some of these, the author's amendments are at like one third of existing law. We think that's going to result in some spillover issues and other things, and so we think that's farther than we can go. So in the bill in its current form, we remain opposed. But just because we think there needs to be some more reasonable thresholds than what's been proposed.
Mr. Chairman, members, David Jones on behalf of the cities of Marin County, Sacramento, and San Marcos. We also share those concerns, just like they can cite anecdotal examples of over parking places. We have plenty of examples in our neighborhoods that are flooding with over car usage and not enough parking. So we would continue to seek moving a little bit further in the local control direction, and the bill does not go far enough at this point. Thank you.
Jonathan Clay on behalf of the City of Encinitas, also echoing the concerns of the previous speakers, and we feel that this should be a local control issue.
Ed Behrens on behalf of the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors, in opposition to the bill for reasons already articulated. We will take a very close look at the amendments.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Paul Gonzalez representing the city of Lakewood, Camarillo, Palmdale, and Concord. We too share the same concerns that the league does, and we respectfully ask for a no vote at this time.
Okay, hold on, Dan. If you had to say what the biggest category, you know, he has these different categories. Which one is the one that is the most concern for the League of Cities and the governments?
Probably well, I'll approach it the other way. I think where we're the closest is the issue of special needs housing. I think we agree that the group those projects focus on their level of car ownership probably tends to be lower than the other categories. But to be frank, on the other three, we still think there were quite a ways apart on those.
Like the senior housing, is that one of the ones you're?
Senior housing in areas that we don't believe have adequate transit. Our premise is that we don't think seniors are selling their cars, especially in areas, if they're physically able to drive, especially in areas that don't have adequate transit. What has been offered here, one aspect of it is if it's within half a mile of a bus stop.
That has eight buses a day, or
right.
there's paratransit available, you know, that kind of stuff.
Potentially not having enough parking could put a senior in a position of having to decide to get rid of their car in an area that they would probably have a lot less mobility. We're just trying to make sure there's an adequate parking. That's our objective.
Okay. Okay. Perhaps the author can respond to the concerns.
Absolutely.
So we can hear that. So
just
it's kind of a compromise you're offering, and I see it as a compromise. Your intentions was to
absolutely
try to meet the concerns so that were raised by the city governments, but also by the members of our committee. So we, you know, could you talk about your proposal in terms of that?
Absolutely. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. And if you recall at the last meeting, the opposition essentially was asking for us to establish some kind of a benchmark, some kind of a baseline instead of a zero parking. And we basically comply with that request. And so we eliminated the zero parking requirement, you know, out of the bill altogether. And we come back essentially today with counter proposals, essentially. And just to put it in proper perspective, with respect to the different categories, the numbers that they asked for was 1, 0.5, and 0.5, and we have offered 0.5, 0.3, and 0.5. So we have actually met them more than halfway in some instances, with the exception of the mixed use, which I think they proposed 0.75, and we have 0.5. So those are the numbers that are on the table. And you know, I think as you probably agree, I think when it comes to affordable housing in the state of California, we are at a crisis state. And I think the overall goal is for us to build more affordable housing. Now the issue is, how do we find that balance between providing sufficient parking or creating some kind of a spillover versus unused parking spaces? And we have taken that approach and essentially used the existing numbers and lower those numbers and then meeting opposition halfway. So in some instances, more than halfway. So I think these ratios are a reasonable attempt to fix the problem. You know, we don't want to, go too far to the left or to the right, because otherwise it would defeat the purpose of the bill.
Okay, questions from committee members? I looked at this and I thought it was, it's like not going to please everybody. Nobody's ever going to agree, but I think it was a reasonable compromise. I'm glad you worked to try to do that. So I felt, it was a reasonable compromise. Yes, Senator Cannell.
More a comment, I guess. I just don't understand the need to take the decision away from local government. As we talked about, if you have a project that doesn't have adequate parking, then what happens is they're going to park in the surrounding neighborhoods. And so it becomes the neighborhood's problem. And the nice thing about local government, if the local government's upset, they can hold people accountable. They can get rid of their council, or they can do whatever they need to do to remedy that. Versus a state law, then there's really no recourse. So I'm still concerned about the overflow into adjacent neighborhoods. So I don't know, Dan, is that a concern of the League of Cities? Have you seen that in the past when there's not proper adequate parking?
Yes, I mean, as one of the other witnesses mentioned, I mean, there are a number of communities where parking is maybe one of the issues that people are running for council on, is because there's too many cars parked on the street, and they feel the prior councils haven't done enough, making sure that developments were adequately parked. Again, we respect the authors and the sponsors' efforts to try to take certain categories of projects that, whether they're near transit or for other reasons, may have a less need for parking than some of these sort of baselines in existing law. But we want, and we respect that certain thresholds have been offered, but we want to test them against more practical reality and make sure that we end up with something that we don't have some of the problems that you're mentioning, Senator.
Do cities currently have the ability to not require any parking for a project that's next to transit?
Well, under existing density bonus law, you have these maximums, if you will, and then the developer, as part of the negotiations under existing law with the city, can negotiate down from that. And so some cities that, if their if their policies is having much less parking, they're completely free to do that. But there are some reasonable, we think reasonable standards in existing law, and if we pull the net out from under those standards, that's where the concern is, because these are maximum standard. If you're working within the context of this law, there is no local control outside of this law. That's why it's important for us to make sure the benchmarks within this law are reasonable.
If I may respond to that real quickly, I think the current law pretty much provides for one parking space per bedroom, for example, and we're using that as a baseline, and we lower our numbers accordingly. Now, but the existing law doesn't address the issue of, let's say, 100% affordable projects, and that's why this bill is so narrowly tailored to limit all these requirements to 100, well, these three categories to only 100% affordable housing. And I think we believe that that's very narrowly tailored in the way that, we are not even requiring zero parking for these people, for these projects, but, we attaching, a baseline for all these three subcategories as well. And one thing that I also want to bring up is the fact that, yes, they do have the ability to negotiate with the developer on lowering the parking standard, but I think the standards are so stringent that, the hands of the developers are being tied sometimes, oftentimes, and the parking study is going to come in really handy, because the city could say, look, I have this parking study that really substantiate for a higher parking ratio. So, that should be taken into consideration, to a large extent. So I think we have some kind of a safeguard, regarding that point that Dan raised. And, we're not taking local control from the cities. I think we're allowing a little more flexibility for the parties to negotiate. So I think, it's the seeking of the balance. Where's that sweet spot for the parking, number of parking? So.
Yeah, I think the concept is to try to encourage money spent on the housing and not the parking, if the parking's not going to be necessary, and that's the goal. But the local government still, in the final decision, can vote yes or no on the project. That doesn't change that at all.
Yeah, very well said.
Yes or no, the council can still say yes, or they can say no. Kathleen Galgiani, Senator Galgiani, and then Senator McGuire and Senator Mendoza. Okay.
I appreciate what you're trying to do, and you live in a jobs-rich area that's housing poor, and I live in a housing-rich area that's jobs poor, so I get you're trying to do the balance. I'm having difficulty with the half of your bill that allows me as a senior to have a half parking space or half a car. That's what I'm having trouble with. Looking around, even in Sacramento here, you have apartment complexes where they allow, if you want a garage or if you want a parking space, you have to pay a little extra to have that. Perhaps that's a way to address it. So here's a question in part two. Are cities allowed, if you have an apartment complex, are you allowed to rent out unused spaces as just parking? Like, for example, around here, I have a lot of staff members who need parking spaces. I think Capitol Towers complex here in Sacramento, I know they require payment for their parking spots if you want a parking space. I think they may allow others to have a monthly spot and pay for that monthly spot. Is that something that local governments allow when?
The bill does not address that specific issue per se. I think whatever existing law would allow will remain allowed. So now, but if I could address your prior question, allowing 0.5 parking space per senior, for example, I think that's the hypothetical you raised. And I think the idea there is to get the average. It's not that every senior citizen has a vehicle, for example. We're taking the average because there's a number of seniors who do not have vehicles, and there are some seniors who do. So I think the idea is to basically find that balance. And that's where that 0.5 came about, so that we don't waste parking spaces enough. And in fact, each of these parking spaces costs $24,000 a pop if it's above ground, and if it's below ground, it's $34,000. And a lot of that money could go to affordable housing. So that's the theory behind this bill, in fact.
Mm-hmm. Might another approach be to allow for the parking spot to be rented to another user in the area? Because it seems like where these areas you're talking about, parking is of a premium anyway, that if there is extra, that certainly if there was an ability for somebody else to pay for a spot that's not being used, I would think that others would jump at that chance to pay to have a spot.
I'll be very happy to look into that a little bit, because that's an idea that we really did not explore too much, but it could be part of the solution as well. So I'll definitely look into that a little bit more after this meeting.
Okay, thank you, Senator. Senator McGuire and then Senator Mendoza.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and do appreciate the work that went into this as well from the chair and from the staff. And I do appreciate the Assemblyman focusing in on this, giving it a week, and then individually reaching out to the members. And sincerely mean that, sir. Really appreciate the time that you took and sincerity in your approach. I was one of the individuals that had some serious concern in the way it was being approached at our previous meeting. While it is not a perfect solution, I think that we've made significant headway. And I just want to say again, though, when we approach issues and we have witnesses coming forward, and this is not at all directed to the Assemblyman, we often talk about Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Jose, vast majority of the state, rural, and that's, or suburban, in which the district that I represent. And that one-size-fits-all approach, when we're talking about a potential empty parking garage, I represent entire communities that won't ever get to a parking garage because they'll never be big enough. And that's why taking a look at ensuring for every 2 units, for example, on the 100% affordable, that there's a parking spot, and being practical with this. Because I think the other important piece with this is that rural folks have cars. There is no public transit. So if you live in a Hoopa, a Eureka, a Willits, you don't have a reliable public transportation system because the funding simply isn't there. So that's why I think that, why I appreciate the Assemblyman focusing in on making a compromise and bringing that forward. Going to be supportive today. I do hear where League of Cities is at, and greatly respect Mr. Kerrigan's incredible tenure here, almost 30 years. My goodness, watch out. But I do think that we've made significant headway, and if there is additional conversation as this bill proceeds, I know that the Assemblyman will be taking that. But I do appreciate your compromise in this, particularly on the 100% affordable project, where I really wanted us to be focused. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Mendoza and Senator Bates. Senator Mendoza.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Chow, for working with us on this bill. I appreciate the outreach you've provided for us and the information, and you know, some of the concerns that have been brought up are still valid. But I know you're working with the opposition. I know you made some amendments here that improve the bill. One thing that still sticks with me that I don't know if you've been able to address with the amendments. I don't think it has. They have with the issue with what happens to the property after 50 years or 55 years. Whenever the low-income housing requirement or agreement is over, because unless your bill says that once you allow affordable housing for whatever population you want, doesn't matter, it's forever. Does your bill say it's forever? It'll be on title, that you cannot, the building cannot be used for anything else but affordable housing? Does your bill mandate that or allow for that to happen?
The bill does not address that specific issue per se, but I'll be happy to look into it a little bit more.
Yeah, because for me, that's my big concern. I don't know if the chair understands where.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah, and you're familiar when you're in the county that most developers don't. I mean, they see that after the building's over, they're going to switch it out and do something else, regular housing. Then you're back to having a parking problem at that particular location, and then we're back to whatever we can do 55 years from now, when this expires. So I would love to. It seems like you might have an answer. Someone.
Sure.
Housing developer, Senator Mendoza. All of the funding that is in affordable housing is often subsidized capital dollars, so agency, state money, et cetera. So what happens in those deals when you hit 50 years is you re-syndicate them and they remain affordable. So because we have so much money in those deals that require that they be affordable, they are affordable beyond the 55 years. They'll be re-syndicated. There'll be new capital dollars in to replace systems and whatnot, but it pretty much remains affordable for the entire life of the property.
I wonder, is that a guarantee or that's just, I would like to ask the League of Cities, I know that was a big fight when I was on the city council. They didn't want to. At that time, it was right at the last year when the city council negotiated. It was like 10 years or something. I was like, what? This is before the state law took effect that it made it to 50 years. Most city councils don't want to continue after a certain amount. They want to just, and most developers will not develop unless they know that it's going to revert back to regular, because that's where they make extra money downstream. So I don't know if that's a guarantee or not.
It's not a guarantee, it's a practice.
I would like to hear from the city that that's a guarantee.
Well, there is no guarantee along those lines. I was trying to look through the bill. Somewhere in the law, existing law, there's the standard affordability covenants that come with this law. But it's fair to ask what happens after that. Another thing I want to point out for the benefit of the committee is, well, there's been a lot of talk about affordable housing. One of these projects that can be developed under this bill is mostly market rate. And that is if a project under density bonus law can provide as little as 5% affordable housing if it's near transit, all the other units are market rate. And under this bill, there is a benchmark of 0.5 per unit. Now, we think that's too low. And we think that if project is mostly market rate, and if the goal is affordable housing, we ought to be making sure there's really an incentive on the affordable side, not on the market rate side, because we think market rate can take care of itself.
So I don't know if the author would be willing to take some sort of amendment, maybe in the next committee as we move forward, where we guarantee that it stays affordable housing. That way the parking issue doesn't arise. Because I think 50 years from now, we're still going to have a housing issue. Special affordable housing issue. Yeah. I would love to see that where we continue to provide that affordable housing 50 years from now when this expires.
I will be happy to look into that issue after the meeting. Now, I think if I may read for your reference existing language, what it says that existing law requires continued affordability for 55 years or longer. Let me underscore that, or longer, as specified, of very low and low-income units that qualify an applicant for density bonus. So by implication, I think if the folks want to maintain that density bonus, they have to, probably prolong that 55-year duration. But I'll, to answer your question, I'll be happy to look into that.
Yeah, I'd rather be more on the sure side than the probability side.
Okay, so possibly. That the affordability component will continue and the parking ratio allowed will continue as long as the affordability is in effect. you do something like that. That's another way of locking it in a little bit more, you know, in terms of, so this goes to government finance after this committee, so we can, if you want us to start.
I have something else to say, but I don't know if Wachowski has something to.
Yeah,
okay.
Senator Bates has a
Okay, well, again, that's my concern. Would you be willing, I don't know if you could amend it this committee, or it might be too late, because you're taking amendments on this committee already, right?
The amendments that I stated earlier will be taken in the next committee, Government and Finance, and that's going to be next week.
I'm on that committee. You want me to, I'll work with you.
Yes,
okay?
thank you.
That'll be the way we handle that.
Thank you.
I'll work with you.
I'll work with the chair on that.
Yeah. I'm on the Government Finance Committee, too. So Senator Bates has a question. Could you finish Senator Mendoza?
One last thing. Well, I know he was finishing up up there. Sure. So I'll be working with the chair in regards to that issue with you, and I'll be supportive of the bill today, but I definitely want to. Now, I know you mentioned earlier that the reason you're carrying this bill, that there's going to be a savings, because if you're not mandating enough parking spaces, and each parking space could actually, it could be up to $10,000 a parking space, depending if you have to build a structure or not, right? So it's going to be some substantial savings from the developer to create this housing, and that way you're saying that those savings can be put towards more affordable housing. Is that guaranteed? Or is that just negotiated between the city and the developer? Or is that guaranteed in your bill that, okay, look, our standards require this many parking spaces, we save you this much, now that's a savings of about X amount of money, you need to put that back into the building and put more housing. If that's the way that's the way the bill works, or that's still something subject to negotiation? Because my experience of developers, they want to make a profit. They don't want to put it back in the building. Whatever the profit is, that's it. That's what we're running off with that. You know what I mean? I don't know if they're going to be willing to put it back into the building.
The intent of the bill is to incentivize developers to build more affordable housing. So one way to do that would be to lower these parking ratios so that they could realize some of these benefits from providing less parking spaces, so that they could basically use the money for more affordable units. So to your question whether or not there's guarantee in the language that they are required to use the money for affordable housing, no.
So there's still
May I add a little bit, Senator? When you build affordable housing, because it's 100% low-income rents, the rents never equate to how much it costs to build.
True.
So there's always what's known as a gap, a very large gap, millions of dollars of a gap. And so what this parking, what AB 744 is going to do is it's going to reduce that gap. So instead of building 2 parking spaces per unit for that homeless project, and you're now building 0.5, you're going to save several millions of dollars. So all of a sudden now, in a way, you've just printed money. You've just created X millions of dollars to help reduce that gap, thereby making that project more feasible. And so by being able to reduce that gap, we're going to see more production of housing units everywhere in California as a result of these, especially for the populations that we need the most housing for. Those are baby boomers that are turning 62 and older. On average, we have the highest percentage of low-income seniors in California at the poverty level or below. So, and then also millennials.
That's my question.
So.
You got your question answered. Senator Bates. And then Senator
Thank you. I'm kind of on the same page as Senator Mendoza regarding what happens in the future. And I can share with you in my community what happened. It once upon a time was called inclusionary zoning, and it started in Orange County many, many years ago. The units that were developed got to be converted, and that created a huge problem for the cities that I represent. We had spillover parking, and residents were outraged. It was a public safety issue. They were parking around these major apartment developments on arterials. A child was killed trying to cross the street, come in between the cars. So it's not such a simple answer that this helps us develop affordable housing. We have all kinds of local government things one has to meet, a developer has to meet in terms of the height of buildings, how much land is there, what the coverage ratio is. And so I think, having something that's cookie cutter for every community just doesn't cut it. It really needs to have more specificity in terms of what the population is.
Yeah, okay.
You're talking about availability to transit. I think we've heard from some of those that live in rural areas. We don't have that. I live in an area that's not rural. It's very suburban, but we actually had to reduce the bus service to those areas because it's not being used because it's not accessible. We have a huge development being developed right by a Metrolink station, but to get to it, it's probably, as the crow flies, within half a mile, but you'd have to go over a wash and crawl over a fence. So that developer would need to build a bridge to get over there, which probably is more expensive than putting more parking in. So I think it's too cookie cutter at this point in time. I think you need to have it more specified to what you're really trying to accomplish in the major metropolis like San Francisco and the major cities, because that's not the situation in suburban California where I live, and rural California where some of my colleagues live. So today I can't support it, but I applaud you because I know you're going in the right direction. We've got to find solutions to this, and you've worked so hard. But I'm not going to be with you today, and hope you'll continue to work on that. And perhaps the league can provide more guidance as you look at different regions in the state of California that this really hinders in terms of those other things cities have to be very concerned about.
Well, thank you very much for your comments. And if I could just respond very briefly on that. And I want to bring it back to the overall goal of this bill. And the goal, in fact, we are basically targeting a very, very narrow, set of situations. For example, 100% affordable units. And, otherwise this provision does not, get triggered. So I think we want to be mindful of that also. But as far as the local control, the intent is not to take any control from the local government. I think when it comes to parking, I think the cities actually provide that control, by way of mediators or timing or whatever. So the city does have control over parking, restrictions as well. So thank you for your comments.
When those are lifted, the developer, the property owner, actually started charging for the parking in some of those developments. And that was another catalyst for the spillover, because people could not afford to pay now for their little covered parking. We're not even talking garages. We're talking, just shelters basically for a car. So there's all kinds of unintended consequences that are going to emanate from this bill if it's approved as presented.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Senator. Senator Rakowski. Bob.
I applaud you, Assemblymember, for bringing this bill, because there are dozens of tone-deaf, bitter city councils that are using the parking requirements to not allow affordable housing to be built in their community. And somebody needs to say that. And the courage that you have brought today by bringing this matter and putting it on the table so that the city councils throughout the state of California get the message that we need to go forward and stop playing games on the parking requirement, because we're all familiar with it. I want to move the bill.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Other comments from senators? I just want to say that obviously it's hard to determine what the proper ratio would be. I think this strikes a good balance. I was pleased to see the American Planning Association, which is the organization of planning professionals, say it looked good with maybe some technical amendments. So I urge support of the motion with the amendments going to Government Finance Committee, and I will work with Senator Mendoza and other senators to clarify some of those issues raised between now and that time with Senator Hertzberg, the chair of that committee. And you have a close on this, please.
I just respectfully ask for arrival, and I'm committed to continue to work with this committee as well as the next committee to make sure that this is the best we can do.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Could call the roll, please. The motion is for approval with the amendments be taken in the Government Finance Committee.
The motion is to pass and refer to the Committee on Governance and Finance. Bell.
Aye.
Bell, aye. Cannella.
No.
Cannella, no. Allen. Bates.
No.
Bates, no. Gaines. Galgiani. Galgiani, no. Leyva.
Aye.
Leyva, aye. McGuire.
Aye.
McGuire, aye. Mendoza. Roth.
Aye.
Roth, aye. Wachowski.
Aye.
Wachowski, aye.
You have 5-3 votes, and we'll wait for other members to vote in this committee. Thank you.
Thank you much.